In this video, I'll introduce you to Earth Studio Tools 1.2. In this project, we'll import 3D shapes into Google Earth Studio. We'll also import and modify KML routes right within Blender. We'll then export the 3D routes generated from Blender back into Google Earth Studio. And finally, we'll composite the final product in Adobe After Effects. This is part 1 of the introduction tutorials. In part 2, we'll cover the Marker Maker functionality to add custom markers to your Google Earth Studio projects. In an effort to support the Earth Studio community, Earth Studio Tools is provided as a free add-on for Blender. To support and subsidize the development, I've set up this channel. A like on this video and a subscription to the channel would help in improving our visibility on YouTube and would be much appreciated. In the coming months, we'll upload more tutorials focusing on various basic projects through to the more complex Blender and Google Earth Studio integrations. So let's get started by downloading the add-on. I'm just going to go to github/Imagiscope/Earth Studio Tools. Links in the description below. We'll go on the code section and then click on Download Zip. We'll save the zip file to our computer. Then jump into the folder where we downloaded the file. We'll extract the zip. And then, as you can see within the folder, there's the GES panel 1.2. We'll jump back over to Blender. We'll go to Edit and then Preferences. Now, as you can see here in the add-ons, we already have an existing edition of Earth Studio Tools. So we'll remove any old versions of it. So we'll click on Remove and then OK. Then we'll install the new one. Not in the zip file, but in the folder. We'll open it up and we'll find the GES panel 1_2.py. We'll install the add-on. Once it's installed, we'll enable it by clicking on the checkbox. We'll just double check our version, 1.2. Now by clicking on the N key, we can expand the panel and we can see Earth Studio tab. And you can see the various sections. Until we actually add a file, most of the sections will be disabled. So let's do that. Let's jump back into Google Earth Studio and create our project. Starting in Google Earth Studio, we're going to zoom in on the city of Valencia in Spain, and more specifically, the City of Arts and Science. And then in a separate tab, we're going to go to the same place in Google My Maps. We're going to identify a start point, which will be the ocean graphic. And we'll type that in to Google My Maps and create a place marker there. Then we're just going to scroll up to the Park Gulliver, and just on the bridge here, we're going to create another point. And now using those 2 points, we'll create our direction. So move point 2 down and we'll put in our first point. And you can see it gives us a fairly direct route along the road there. The nice feature about My Maps is that we can drag the route itself to create our own route that we want to use. So in doing so, I want to go down or go around these 2 roundabouts and then past the buildings in the City of Arts and Sciences. Now using the kebab menu, we're going to select Export to KML, KMZ. We'll select our directions. We'll export as a KML instead of a KMZ. And then we'll select an area on our computer to save the file. Give the file an appropriate name. And we'll save it to our system. Now switching back over to Google Earth Studio, we're going to import the KML file that we just saved. And you can see it displayed here on the map. You'll notice that some of the blue lines disappear underneath the bridge. This is due to the KML file following the terrain of the Google Earth Studio information, whereas we really wanted to follow the terrain in addition to the structural 3D elements. With Earth Studio Tools, we're going to be able to retrain the KML information so that it does include both the terrain elements as well as structural elements, like bridges. So we've created our first track point at the very beginning of the KML route. I've named this one Start. And now what we'll do is go through and create our project using keyframes. We want to follow the KML route at a consistent pace. I'll be adding a keyframe at approximately 10-second intervals. Once I've completed the rough animation, I'll go back and space them out. I'll use the Map Path window to adjust the curves to smooth out the transition in the corners. I'll then open up the graph editor and adjust any fine details using the handles. For most projects, I'll create a top view, either at the beginning or the end of the animation. This makes it easier to edit the route path within Blender. The top view frames can be edited out in the final animation. And once I'm happy with the changes, I'll save the file. And now we're ready to render, so we'll just make sure that we turn off our KML route so that it doesn't appear in our final render. And I'm going to be using the JPEG image sequence as it gives us a little bit better quality to work with. So now that it's finished rendering, I forgot I need to add one more track point, so I'm just going to add a track point here. And I'm going to name this one Art. So I'll just use the export 3D tracking data. I'm going to use a JSON file, and I'll just overwrite the file that was created when we rendered. Now switching over to Blender, we're going to delete our default cube, and using the Earth Studio tools, which is accessible by pressing the key N and then selecting the Earth Studios tab, we'll select the image sequence and then also the JSON file. We'll then click on Import Earth Studio, and it will create the Earth Studio environment in Blender. As you can see, the track points are visible as planes within Blender. We're going to put our cursor here in the middle of this one here called Art, and then create a UV sphere. One of the new features of Earth Studios 1.2 is the ability to export 3D objects from Blender into Google Earth Studio. We'll be doing that with this sphere. So I'm just going to place it above the plane. Then using the export object as KML, I'm going to give it a color. I'll also use the line color option and give it a line width of 1. Now, destination folder is set to the same location as our file. Since we haven't saved it yet, we'll do that and we'll give it a name and save it. So we can just leave that as is, and now we can give it a file name. We'll give this one a file name called Art. Now jumping back to Google Earth Studio, we'll open up the art.kml file, and you can see we now have an object, a 3D object from Blender in Google Earth Studio. This technology basically cheats the system. KML wasn't designed for 3D models. While you can render the 3D objects out of Google Earth Studio, the greater benefit is using it for masking, as I'll show in this project. Additionally, you'll want to keep your objects fairly simple, as KML files can clog down the system if they're too complex. What we'll be creating here is just a start marker, an arrow. So using a plane as my starting point, bring one of the vertices in, and then I'll scale these two vertices and we'll create a little bit of a star track pendant. And this will be our start marker. Now switching back to object view, you can see that we've got it here. We'll just rotate it to the right position. And align that straight. And now we can export this also to Google Earth Studio. We'll turn our line off and we'll change color and we'll give it a name. And now we can import the arrow marker. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to add our KML route. To get the best possible looking route, we want to extract some of the data from the 3D buildings and the terrain, most notably the elevation data. As you can see here, the KML route follows the terrain information. So it applies the route under the bridge. We want it actually over the bridge. However, you'll notice if I put a track point there, it's actually floating on where the 3D element is, which is the bridge. So we want to set our track points along the KML route, extracting the elevation data as we go. One thing you'll also notice about this route is it's off a little bit. This sometimes happens with the Google Earth or Google Map data that's generated to create directions, usually due to slight changes or decimal places in creating the route information. So what I'm doing here is at each intersection and along the way at approximately 200 100-meter intervals, I'm putting a track point over top of the KML information. I don't have to be exactly precise, but I do want to get fairly close so that I can match up the data within Blender. One of the new features of version 1.2 of Earth Studio Tools is the ability to edit the KML information within Blender. This means that we can adjust the KML to correct for issues as we see here. And I've added about 40 track points, so we're ready to now export that data. So we'll select Export 3D Tracking Data, we'll select a JSON file and give it a different file name. And we'll save that to the folder. Now switching back over to Blender, we're going to delete the previous data that we imported. So we'll select GES World Art and Start. We'll right mouse click and select delete. This will keep the camera, and we're just going to change the JSON file to the new track point file. We'll then select the scene collection and create a new collection here, and we'll name this one Imported. With the new collection selected, we'll then click on Import Earth Studio. So this will bring in the new GES world, which contains all of the track points that we'll be using for the route elevation. By putting it into its own collection, we can turn it on and off. This will allow us to hide it during the rendering process. Now with the camera selected, we'll go to the camera properties. We still have the original route images from the first import, so you can see the two sets of images there. We'll just delete the first one and use the second one that we just imported. Technically, they're the same set of images, but we'll remove one of them to speed up the processing. So scrubbing through the project, you can see the track points that we've laid down. Now we'll import the KML file to overlay on the track points. We're selecting the same KML file that we used in Google Earth Studio. We're going to select our Snap to track point as the start item, and we're going to use the curve as NURBS, which is a little bit smoother. We'll set a bevel depth of 0.02, and we aren't going to add any elevation. We'll then make sure that the follow terrain checkbox is checked, and then we'll find the JSON file with our track points in it. We'll set our point reduction to 2 and our match proximity to 1 meter. We'll then click on the Import KML route. As you can see here, the KML route information has been overlaid using the elevation of the track points. We'll now switch to viewport shading, and our background disappears. This will reappear if we click on the camera icon and then select the film to be transparent. This will now then again show the background. By default, the KML route comes in as a tube. We're going to change this to a rectangular route path. We'll set our 3D cursor to our starting point. We'll then add a mesh plane and resize it. Now we'll select the route path, and we want to associate it to that new square shape that we created. So we'll go to Geometry and Object. You'll see that nothing's selected here. We need to convert our mesh object to a curve. So I'm just going to move it off to the side here so we can see it a little bit better. We'll then go to Object, Convert to, then we'll select Curve. We'll then reselect the route path. Turn off these relationship lines so we can see a little bit better. Scroll down and then For the object, we can now select plane 001. You can see now that the route path has taken the shape of the plane itself, which is a square. We'll turn off the smoothing so we get the sharp edges. We can now edit our shape to give it the right rotation and size that we're looking for. So we select the object, press Tab, and then we can adjust the individual points. So I'm going to make this a little bit more rectangular, and then I will select all the points. There we go, and rotate it so that it's parallel to the road surface. For shape and rotation items, you'll want to be in edit mode. For resizing, you can do it in either object or edit mode. Now give our route a little color, so we'll select the route and add a material to it. We'll add the fill caps also as the option. And we'll just scrub through the video here, just make sure that all the parts of the route are in place. And everything looks there. So now we're just going to clean up our path. First of all, we're going to smooth out some of the edges there. Go to the Order U area, and we're going to up the value to 4 to smooth the corners. Scrubbing to our overhead frame, we'll press Tab on the keyboard to enter edit mode, where we'll be able to adjust the individual points and correct issues from the export from Google Maps. We'll adjust the individual points so they line up with the road surface. Now, from an altitude perspective, we did use the track points to put them in the correct position. And so through the cleanup process here, the altitude will maintain the same as long as we're using the XY constraint, which is the blue box in this instance here, to move the individual points. When I can, I try to remove the number of points also. This reduces the size of the file that we'll be exporting to Google Earth Studio. To remove a point, simply select it and then press Delete and select Vertices. When the cleanup is done, we're ready to export this to Google Earth Studio. In the same manner as before, we select the object, give it a color and a name, then click on Export Object as KML. As we'll be using this route as a mask, I'm using a magenta color. I'm also going to overwrite the art.kml file with a magenta color as well. Now switching back over to Google Earth Studio, we'll import the new route file, and we're going to import our new art object. For many purposes, this might just be enough, being able to put the route into Google Earth Studio. You can render again with the KML showing in the rendered output. Since we'll be combining our 3D render from Blender, we'll be using this as a mask. Because the KML object interacts with the 3D elements, the path will not be visible when hidden behind 3D objects. This creates an automatic mask or green screen that we can use to overlay additional graphic elements. For either method, we're going to render it out. We're going to give this one a new file name of route mask. Again, we'll be doing the image sequence. So while that's rendering, we'll switch back over to Blender and we'll dress this up a little bit. We'll start by creating our path reveal. In the start and end mapping in our route's properties, we'll set them both to 0. We'll then put a keyframe at our starting point by pressing the I key. We'll then scrub to the end of the animation and change our end value to 1 and press the I key. Then scrubbing through, we'll set individual keyframes so that the path appears in the frame. Once the route animation is complete, we'll dress up a couple of the other items. We'll change our start marker to green. We'll also add an environment by changing the color to an environment texture. We'll then select a HDRI from our system. This will add light to the scene as well as reflections on shiny objects. We then want to go to that art object that we have, and we're going to replace that. Using a pen from the File menu, I'm going to add an object I created earlier. I can now move this object to the position where the art piece was. I'll resize the object to be slightly smaller than the globe that we used for the KML file. This animated art piece will replace the magenta globe we have in Google Earth Studio. I'll just finalize the look by adding some colors to the different rings. So that looks good, so I think we're pretty much ready to render. So we'll do a test render of one of the frames and see we need to hide some items here. So we'll make our render layer or camera visible, and we'll deselect what we don't want to see. And we can see just the art piece there and the KML. So we'll try a couple different frames. So we'll set our output folder. We'll create a new one called brender. And we'll go inside that folder and give this a prefix of rend and accept that. And we'll render the animation. Now that all the renders are done, we're going to open up Adobe After Effects to bring it all together. In a new project, we're going to right mouse click in the project area and select Import File. We're going to import the first render we did in Google Earth Studio. We'll then import the second render from Google Earth Studio with the KML math. We'll drag down our first render to create the composition. And we'll drag down our mask over top. We then want to create a mask layer by comparing the differences between the two images. To do this, we're going to use the difference mat. We'll drag that to the first render. In the difference mat, we'll select the mask as our difference layer. When hiding the mask layer, you can see that it's displaying just the differences between the two sets of images. We'll set our matching tolerance to 7% and our blur before difference to 0.01 pixels. We'll then use this mask with our rendered images from Blender. We'll import the images from our system. We'll then drag the images below our mask layer. Since the Google Earth Studio images were rendered in a higher resolution, we're going to pre-compose these and then reduce their size. We'll select both the rendered images from Google Earth Studio and then select Pre-compose. We'll call this layer Masked. We'll expand the options, and since these images were rendered at 1620 vertical resolution, we'll set our scale at 66.666%, which will match our target HD resolution. We'll then modify the composition settings to match the HD resolution. Now selecting the Blender rendered layer, we'll select the track matte to alpha. This will use the mask from the layer above to combine the Blender rendered images. You can see the cutouts of the various objects from the Google Earth Studio renders. Here you can see the streetlights. Here's the inclusion of the art object that we added. To bring it all together, we'll take our original render and place it at the very bottom. Again, this is scaled, so we'll reduce the size to 66.666. And we'll do a quick inspection of the elements. You can see that the KML path is passing behind trees and buildings. And if we zoom in here, you can see the streetlights are even overlaid on top of the KML image itself. So I think we're about ready to do our final render. And so we'll select File and Export. We'll add it to the render queue, and this is what the final image looks like. Feel free to leave a comment below, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We'll be coming out with more videos here soon. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.